No full employment. No fair trade. Now that we understand the simple financial flows, we can return to thinking about the human and economic impacts of trade. Too often, the US doesn't just lose dollars to the rest of the world. It loses jobs too. As we discussed above, most of the angst people feel when they think about US trade deficits appears to stem from pain. Especially the pain that comes from unemployment as American businesses close up shop and ship jobs overseas. As MMT economist Pavlina Kidneva has documented, unemployment resembles an epidemic. Like a virus, it affects other health people nearby, resulting not only in lost income, but higher mortality and suicide rates, and a permanent decline in well-being. But it's easier to blame immigrant workers, foreign currency manipulators, or even global technology than to come to terms with the fact that the joblessness is an official policy in the United States. I have argued that one of the best answers to, quote, they took our jobs, is, quote, everyone gets a job. The MMT solution, that is, to involuntary unemployment, is to introduce federal job guarantee that establishes a legal right to a good job at good wages with good benefits. This would address one of the most pernicious effects stemming from trade. The unemployment is too often visited upon whole communities as jobs are lost to foreign competitors. It's not enough just to provide training and other temporary forms of assistance to workers whose jobs are lost to foreign competition. Federal programs like Trade Adjustment Assistance, TAA, are important, but something more is needed. That something is a federal job guarantee. By no means is it a panacea, but at a minimum, it begins to tackle the problem of unemployment directly, as opposed to subsidizing the effects of unemployment. By that, she means unemployment insurance. Through the thick and thin of the business cycle, we leave tens of millions of Americans idle in the belief that this makes political, economic, and social sense. Consider the closure of the Harley-Davidson manufacturing facility in Kansas City, Missouri, the city in which I taught for 17 years. The company's 800 workers were left stunned by the announcement that ultimately resulted in a net loss of 350 jobs. The timing is particularly pernicious, coming as it did against the backdrop of a dividend increase for shareholders and an announcement that the company would spend millions buying back up to 15 million shares of its own stock. Had a federal job guarantee program been in place, it would have mitigated the impact of its closure. At a minimum, it would have provided the workers whose jobs were lost with a way to remain employed right in their communities, but would have done more than that. The benefits of a federal job guarantee not only include the production of goods, services, and income. The guarantee also features on-the-job training and skill development, poverty alleviations, community building, and social networking, social, political, and economic stability, and social multipliers, positive feedback loops, and reinforcing dynamics that create a virtuous cycle of socio-economic benefits. With a program like this in place, the government would have mitigated the localized devastation of communities that directly experience the loss of well-paying U.S. industrial jobs. And to add a bit more to that, I'm sure you guys have seen lately too with these companies that, will go filing for bankruptcy, or hey, we're going to lay off 1,000 workers, but yet we're going to give the CEO a $200 million pay raise, and everyone on the board of directors is getting a $5 million pay raise. Or even other business that shuts down, well, the CEO gets a golden parachute on his way out. That's what she's referring to in here, is, hey, our jobs are gone, we have to go to unemployment to find a different job, and how's it fair that these people who shut down the factory are getting increases in wages? So that's what she's trying to talk about and how it really isn't fair. It may be hard to imagine an economy that doesn't allow millions to fall by the wayside. But that's because America has almost never achieved anything like true full employment. It's something we've rarely experienced outside of wartime. One of the most important features of a job guarantee program is that it maintains a form full form of full employment, but immediately rehiring the unemployed into public service work, providing them with income, and then returning required when they are displaced by trade shocks. In this way, the job guarantee can serve as the core of a response to both, quote, free trade and the trade war. With a job guarantee, free trade is no longer a threat to full employment, and trade wars are no longer necessary to prevent full unemployment. Trade negotiations can then focus on labor standards and environmental sustainability, with the U.S. using its market power to promote acceptable working conditions and environment standards worldwide. Today, Chinese firms sell American households many environmentally unfriendly products. In addition, people all over the world currently endure unsafe and unsanitary working conditions in order to provide America its surplus. If you want to prioritize the well-being of workers worldwide, communities, and the planet as a whole, then we need a new approach to global trade. Especially in an era of global climate crisis, we should not be suckered by the simplistic rhetoric of countries winning and losing. The quality of trade, is at least as important as the quantity of trade. What ends and whose interest are our trade relationships serving? Just like the fiscal policy, the big scary number that is the trade deficit is not worthy of so much attention. As MMT reminds us, real resources, real social needs, and real environmental benefits are what matters most when it comes to trade policy. At this point, it's important to understand a bit more about our trading partners around the world, and the United States' special privileges compared to other countries. So far, we've discussed how global trade affects the United States and how MMT can make the trade flows into and out of our own country more productive and humane. But what about Britain, France, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Venezuela, and all the other nations out there? The special position of the US dollar. Since the 1970s, there has been a fundamental shift in the way our monetary system operates. This shift redefines how we should think about macroeconomics and the role of a national government that issues its own currency. Unfortunately, on the question of trade, as in so many other matters, policymakers remain locked in an anachronistic framework that belongs to the bygone gold standard era. From the middle of the 19th century until the Nixon gold shock that ended US dollar convertibility in the early 1970s, the gold standard, in one form or another, served as the common monetary framework, regulating domestic economies and trade between them. Although the framework's restrictions were gradually loosened, the overriding principle remained the same. In all countries, the monetary authority effectively tethered the value of its currency to gold by standing ready to buy or sell gold, or US dollars, to meet any supply or demand, and balance arising from international trade to carry out those interventions. The central bank, or equivalent in those days, had to maintain enough gold, or US dollars, to back the circulating currency at a fixed exchange rate. A gold standard is only credible if the government can make good on its promise to convert the currency to gold at a fixed price. Having enough gold was critical, and running a trade surplus was the surest way to build up a country's gold reserves. Controversially, trade deficits led to an overflow of gold, since countries used gold to pay for their imports. Tried to prevent the loss of gold reserves, interest rates were frequently raised to draw the flow of gold bullion back into the domestic demand back into the country. The idea is that the higher interest rates would slow down domestic demand sufficiently, meaning fewer imports and therefore less gold flowing out of the country, while the higher returns promised by increased rates would encourage more gold inflows. But raising interest rates to reserve an outflow of gold often meant that governments weren't free to keep interest rates low to support their domestic economies. Even when high interest rates succeeded in protecting gold reserves, the policy often had devastating consequences. That's because rising interest rates frequently triggered an economic slowdown, which meant that many of the citizens of the affected country had to endure domestic recessions and entrenched unemployment, So the gold standard created a recessionary bias in its economies operating with trade deficits. The inflexibility of the system prevented governments from focusing on full employment. The gold standard system was suspended during World War I and World War II, and the U.S. and other nations needed expanded policy space to run big deficits, creating lots of green dollars. In order to fight the wars, it was reestablished during the interwar years, placing considerable stress on the global economy. During the Great Depression, if we still had this kind of system today, then Donald Trump's desire to wipe out the U.S. trade deficit would make far more sense. After World War II, a new international monetary system was born. The new system restored convertibility by replacing the old gold standard with a new gold exchange standard. Instead of directly pegging currencies to a fixed price for gold, the system was replaced by convertibility into the U.S. dollar, reflecting the dominance of the U.S. and world trade and the fact that the Allies won the war. Keep that in mind. This new system, known as the Bretton Woods Framework, called for the U.S. dollar to be pegged to the value of gold. Moreover, all other currencies in this system were then pegged to the U.S. dollar's value. The exchange rate at the time set the price of gold to $35 an ounce. And this right here is what helped us be able to rebuild Europe after World War II through the Marshall Plan under Truman and other things after that. In effect, Bretton Woods recreated a gold standard system, one step removed, with the U.S. dollar now providing the central link in the monetary chain. Governments can now sell gold to the United States Treasury at the price of $35 per ounce. And the U.S. Treasury had to honor the term of that exchange in 1971, following growing trade deficits caused in part by the Vietnam War. Now, one thing, for people who don't know, Vietnam War was actually originally France's war. They wanted, they just wanted to go in Vietnam for geopolitical reasons. And we, the United States, got involved because Ho Chi Minh was a Marxist dude who learned his more, communist Marxist ideologies from France. Little fun fact for you. So the United States never should have been involved in Vietnam in the first place. But I digress from that. Other countries became concerned that the U.S. gold holdings were no longer adequate to cover a number of dollars in circulation at the fixed exchange rate. To stem pressures on the dollar, President Richard Milhous Nixon shocked the world by declaring a temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. A second shock followed in 1973 when Nixon announced that he was making the temporary suspension permanent. Nixon's move was brought about by the realization that the U.S. needed more policy space than was available under Bretton Woods. And that's why we're able to do a lot of the currency exchanges and the issuing of unlimited money, and how the US dollars become kind of the world's currency now through the IMF and World Bank, etc. That's just also really the reason why. So, announcing the change in policy, Nixon declared, and quote, "We must create more and better jobs. We must stop the rise in the cost of living. We must protect the dollar from the attacks of international monetary speculators." End quote. To achieve the first two goals, he proposed tax cuts and a 90-day freeze on prices and wages. To achieve the third, Nixon directed the suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. Ultimately, the resultant social instability throughout the world caused the system to collapse. It had been under pressure in the 1960s with a series of competitive devaluations, weakening one's currency to improve competitiveness in the trade arena. By the UK and other countries that were facing chronically high unemployment due to persistent trade problems, Richard Nixon delivered the coup de grace in 1971. This ended the gold standard. From this point on, most major currencies were no longer on a fixed exchange rate. Abandoning fixed exchange rates and floating the currency gave currency issuing governments like the U.S. expanded policy space to sustain full employment. Another reason why Nixon did this. Notwithstanding the collapse of the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates, gold standard thinking still dominates our discourse on trade policy, which is why so many politicians still regard trade deficits as inherently dangerous. They're not. on a gold standard that the government can run out of gold. And technically, yes, we can run out of gold because, just like many other minerals, gold is a limited resource. I mean, Africa has a lot of gold. There might be some European countries have some gold left, but at some point, gold's going to run out. What are you going to do? So that's just something to keep in mind as well for those who are going on education on international policy or international affairs or economics or even foreign relations or whatever. This is something you'll have to know. With the end of the gold standard and our fixed global exchange rates, this kind of thinking is no longer valid. The only residual legacy left in the Bretton Woods is that the US dollar still plays a central role in the global economy. When companies and governments around the world engage and trade with one another, they write an enormous portion of those contracts in US dollars. Even when the country doing the buying and the country doing the selling don't use dollars as their internal domestic currency, a handful of other major currencies like the euro play a role like this as well, but none come close to dominating the markets like the US dollar does. Nearly 90% of currency trading involves the US dollar, as I just stated earlier. This is the situation people are referring to when they say the US dollar is the dominant global currency. Could that change? Yes, of course. Nothing lasts forever. As MMT economist L. Randall Wright put it, and quote, the dollar will not always reign supreme, but it has a lot of life remaining as the most desirable asset to hold in portfolios, end quote. The spectrum of monetary sovereignty. Monetary sovereignty is key to understanding MMT. Governments need a high degree of monetary sovereignty in order to exercise policy autonomy. That is, to be able to run their fiscal and monetary policies without fear of painful backlash from financial or foreign exchange markets. Many countries possess, but don't take, full advantage of their monetary sovereignty. In addition to the United States, countries like the United Kingdom, Japan, Canada, and Australia, to name a few, enjoy a high degree of monetary sovereignty. They all issue inconvertible flat currencies, and they largely refrain from borrowing in currencies that aren't their own. Generally speaking, countries that fit that set of criteria will have greater monetary sovereignty and thus more policy autonomy when it comes to managing their own economic destinies. And they are free. They needn't agonize over government deficits or trade deficits. And they are free to focus their domestic policy agenda on achieving macroeconomic goals, like full employment and price stability. Not every government enjoys this much policy flexibility. Some nations have weakened their monetary sovereignty, either by pegging their exchange rates, Bermuda, Venezuela, and Niger, abandoning their national currencies, all 19 countries in the Eurozone, Ecuador, and Panama, or by borrowing heavily in US dollars or other foreign currencies, Ukraine, Argentina, Turkey, and Brazil. Doing any of these things compromises a nation's monetary sovereignty and diminishes its policy flexibility. Most developing economies are at the weaker end of the sovereignty spectrum. Even those that can issue a non-convertible fiat currency usually can't afford to ignore fiscal and trade imbalances. That's because most poor developing nations rely on imports to meet vital social needs, like food, oil, medicines, technologies. And that means they have to worry about how they're going to get enough foreign currency, usually US dollars, to pay for imports. May end up borrowing in US dollars and then struggling to repay those loans. For these and other reasons, many countries around the world are stuck in a situation where they can't rely on their own currency issuing powers to build a good economy for all other people. Developing country situations like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, which is very predatory, and it's a very terrible organization. For those who don't believe that, look it up. But it never seems to be enough to help them escape the trap of needing to rely on foreign currency for their survival. By running trade deficits, the U.S. allows these countries to build up their U.S. dollar reserves. Those dollars are a lifeline to get the food and medicines and other critical imports they need that many developing countries depend on for survival. They also help many indebted nations earn the currency they need to repay those loans to the IMF and other foreign lenders. In a very important sense, America's trade deficits are not optional. Much of the world simply must run trade surpluses with America. I'm going to go ahead and pause it there. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you learned a thing or two and enjoyed learning more about, trade policies and trade deals. I know she does talk a lot about, deficits and debt. That's the whole premise of economics, especially in America. I would highly recommend you guys looking really more into how the Eurozone works, how the European Union works, and just, like I just mentioned a minute ago, do some research into the IMF and the World Bank and some of these organizations that are basically ran by the United States. And you'll get a pretty good, clear idea of what actually goes on there. But other than that, again, I appreciate you guys coming back again and showing support. It means a lot. I wanted to start this channel as a side project, nothing to be, done full time. Just thought, I could go and try to educate people the best I could through reading books. There's already enough political commentary channels out there. If you guys want me to do, maybe certain segments on a breaking news story, I'll do that, read it over, and give a commentary like others. But other than that, you guys have a great day, and see you next time.